Welcome to the Executive Coaching Podcast, where Executive Coach Alicia Cowan will discuss leadership topics and coaching solutions to tackle the most difficult problems that keep you from leading your team to success.
Hey there, leaders. It's Alicia Cowan. Welcome to episode number 85. As I'm recording this, we are in mid-February 2026, and Valentine's Day and President's Day holiday weekend just passed. Hope you had a fantastic one. I spent the weekend in Sarasota. My 16-year-old daughter, well, about to be 16 on the 24th, my daughter had a 16-year-old, sweet 16 birthday party this past weekend. And so my husband and I were down in Sarasota with about, 12 girls having a birthday party. And the weather was fantastic, and we had a really great weekend. And so coming off of a very busy weekend and now recording this for you all, my friends. So I hope you had a fantastic one. Today, what we're going to talk about is executive presence and positioning. So a big thing I see is a lot of you executive leaders, you have goals that you say you want, and we're going to talk about how do you align how you show up with those goals. Here's what I see. Sometimes if you don't intentionally align how you're showing up with where you're headed and where you're going, you will stall out no matter how strong your performance is. And so that's the problem I want to address today. It's something that I've seen recently, and I want to call out some ways to help you. And potentially you can look at this yourself and do an audit of how you're showing up and where you want to go. In January, we talked a lot about goal setting and executive presence and what we want to do in 2026. And in this February, as we're still in this quarter, I want to help you align your executive presence with those goals, where we're headed, and what we want to do this year. So some very tangible, tactical things that I'm going to put into play, into practice this episode that will hopefully help you align those goals with your presence. So I want to talk about what I'm seeing in at senior executive levels. How you show up and your executive presence absolutely matters as much, maybe if not more, as what you deliver. And what I see here is that you can be truly exceptional at your job, but as a senior leader, you could still show up in a way that is still invisible to the people that matter, that are making decisions on your career, that are impacting your livelihood. And so here's the problem I see. Some things that I see that show up with my clients and people that I'm talking to about their careers. Number one is that high performers and top talent can make the mistake of assuming that their effort will just equate naturally to advancement without thinking about the other factors at play. They just want to put their head down, perform, execute, and they think they're just going to naturally just be rewarded for that. And we are not in that day in that era anymore. And so we're going to myth bust that. Number two, I see sometimes executives outgrowing behaviors that once made them successful, but they're really clinging to some of those behaviors that they need to let go of now that they're at the senior executive level. And so that can be really tricky, because if we've been rewarded time and time again for all these behaviors that made them successful, it can be really hard to let go of, right? Because you cling to those things that you believe will work. But once you hit a senior executive level, some of the things that you're clinging to won't work anymore. I think about delegation and holding on to some work that you think only you can do, as an example. The third problem I see is that executive presence gaps are rarely called out directly through feedback. A lot of leaders are left without clarity around what executive presence gaps that they have, just simply because people don't know how to say it. They don't know how to give the feedback. They don't know how to put it into words and really clearly articulate exactly what it is. Sometimes it's those things you just can't put your finger on. And so it's really hard to be explicit. And so sometimes, even though maybe well-intended, sometimes your senior leadership group can't give you the feedback that you need around your executive presence because they don't have the words themselves. So that's the promise I'm going to give you today, is that we are going to talk about how do you intentionally align how you show up with the goals that you say you want without, here's the big asterisk, without becoming somebody that you're not. All right. So let's dive into part one. I want to talk about performance can stop carrying you. So here's the insight that I have. At senior executive levels, performance starts to become the baseline and not the differentiator. So, what do I mean by that? What changes when you get to the top of the executive and corporate ladder is that your performance is secondary. It's what we call table stakes, meaning it's just expected at that level for you to perform. It is not the differentiator that's going to get you advancement just alone in and of itself. So let me be clear. I'm not saying it's not important. I'm not saying it's not expected. I'm saying it is a baseline of what is expected. So a lot of times what this looks like. Metrics are important here, but it's less about metrics. It's more about the judgment calls you make and the decisions that you're making. It's less about individual execution. It is more about your influence across the organization. So that means it looks like less tasks that are more junior or at the lower level, more influence across globally across the organization. It's about getting fewer instructions and having way more ambiguity and less feedback. You have to be able to operate in the gray as a senior leader. No one is coming to save you, especially a lot of times, and no one is going to be telling you exactly what to do, which can be really frustrating and jarring at first. But sometimes even turning to your CEO or turning to the board of directors, like sometimes they don't exactly have all the answers and know exactly what to do. I was just coaching somebody last week. We were talking about a senior leadership team that turned over and a whole new leadership team came into place and everybody was looking around at each other waiting for direction, no, not wanting to step on anybody's toes. And after about a quarter of this, like realizing like, oh, we have to be the ones because we are the new leadership team. And it is time for somebody to start taking the lead and leading this group and doing things differently. And so that's a really big thing, right? Is just to realize that your performance is just a secondary thing. And that is hard, again, because of that reward system. Once I was working with a leader that was delivering every single quarter, time over time, performance was high, doing a great job. The direct reports, her team loved her, but she kept getting passed over for the next level promotion. So after coaching, what we dug into is what we realized is she started losing her own voice in this larger leadership room. She was the one who would hold back and speak last in meetings. She started framing up her ideas as questions instead of taking a stand and taking her position on topics. And then she would also defer way too quickly to louder voices in the room. She wasn't as confident as she needed to be amongst her peer group. And so she would automatically assume that everybody with more experience on the leadership team knew better than her. And so she wouldn't share ideas on maybe the topics or the challenges that they had at hand. And so here's the result of that. The leadership team saw her as somebody that was steady, that was reliable, but definitely not ready for the next level promotion. So here's the coaching that we did together. And the thing is, she wasn't necessarily lacking confidence in her own performance. She had that. She knew she could deliver results. However, she wasn't showing up like a enterprise leader. She was showing up more like a function leader. And the difference is she could confidently show up within her own function, within the area that she had her expertise, like within her business unit. But when it came to being in that room with the other executive team leaders and managing as an enterprise leader, making decisions that would impact the entire company, that's where we needed to work with her confidence. And so again, what I'm saying here is performance doesn't necessarily equate to getting yourself ready for that next level promotion. You've got to make that switch where you can lead your department and function, but then start showing up confidently as an enterprise leader. All right. The next part that I'm going to talk about the difference and the gap between your intentions as a senior executive leader and the impact that you're making as a leader. So here's the core of it. Your intentions as a senior executive does not equate and equal to your impact. And I will say this, a lot of executives can be really blind to this gap. So let me describe in more detail some misalignments that I see. And what I will say this, some executives hide behind some statements that sound very altruistic, but they are deeply rooted more so in fear. So it's kind of like that iceberg. It may sound nice right at the top and everything looks nice above the water, but beneath it, the core of it and the bigger base is this fear base underneath the water. So let me give you some examples of some of these statements. And again, this is, of course, not an all-inclusive list, but I want to give you some examples to see if you've ever identified with any of these. The first one can be something along the lines of like, well, I don't want to play the political game. I don't want to play the politics in corporate. Now, sounds nice, but unfortunately, at a senior executive level, you already are playing politics of what happens in the company. And so while this sounds nice and well intended, it does come across a little bit disengaged. It comes across as conflict avoidant, and it comes across as fearful. And probably not somebody's intention when they say that. But you got to really dig deeper when some of these nice sounding statements come across. Another one, if you're up for making a decision and you need to go and collaborate with everyone in the company and hide behind the statement of, I want to be really seen as collaborative instead of making a decision, sometimes that can really be seen as indecisive when you are defaulting to somebody else or you need to have a decision making by a committee. Now, let me give an asterisk there. I'm not saying you don't need to you need to make every decision in a silo and you don't need to get others' opinions. But I think the difference is when this is always what you default to, is it seeing what everybody else thinks. And again, definitely not saying you don't need to operate democratically, but you need to understand when that's becoming a crux. Another one, the statement of, I value humility and I like to be humble. Again, sounds really, really nice. Great quality to have. Not saying there's anything wrong with that. However, when used as a crutch, it can read as lack of conviction, and it can also show that maybe you're lacking in self-confidence. For example, if you're asking about your accomplishments or your team's accomplishments and you don't want to give recognition to the team or talk about some of the wins that the team is having because you want to be super humble about it, again, nothing's wrong with the trait of humility, but notice if there's times where you might be hiding behind a statement that sounds really beautiful. Again, we're trying to match up intentions and the effect. So let me give an example of this. One time, a leader that I was working with believed that his intention was to empower his team and give them autonomy, but he did it by staying hands off. He was delegating the leadership of his team and his people to a more senior leader on his team that didn't necessarily have the authority. He was given the authority, but didn't have the direct reporting relationship to lead these people. And so he was just delegating his own leadership to another senior leader on his team. So while this was well intended by giving autonomy and giving this person stretch work and thought he was empowering this leader, the reality of what happened was that his absence created uncertainty amongst the team. They were frustrated because they had a peer that didn't necessarily have the direct reporting relationship to manage them. Decisions started to stall out, and his team read this like silence as and lack of direction as not having any vision for the future. And so while the intention that he thought he was giving was autonomy and empowerment, it really came off as fear-based and definitely came off as fear-based of not being liked. And so we had to reframe some things. We had to bring in and say that executive presence is not about dominating and domineering over the team. It's actually about giving the team clarity. And yes, While a lot of leaders, I get it, you want to be liked, and everyone may not like the decision that you're making at the time. In fact, I can guarantee that everyone on your team is not going to like every single decision you make ever. But the people that you are aligned with and the people that you're leading on your team will respect you for it. And the people that are consistently unhappy with some of the decisions and direction that you're making, again, that is okay. The goal is not to be 100% liked 100% of the time, but the goal is to lead the team in the direction that you think is the best direction that you have at the time. And so here's a little takeaway I want to give you as my listeners. Here's some questions you can ask. How are people experiencing me when I speak and when I lead? What do I avoid that actually might be required at my level? And how can I get an objective point of view to help me see some of these gaps? All right, friends. Okay, let's dive into part three. The third part that I see executive leaders tend to do is sometimes if people have this, again, altruistic thought of having authenticity, but without a strategy, it can be very career limiting. So let's dive into what this insight really means. It means when we say we want to be authentic, and it sounds really nice to stay authentic to who you are. Authenticity and just hiding behind authenticity, it's not a permission to stay static as you are. So this sounds really nice. I want to stay authentic. I think you've got to know the difference. And what I mean by that is that as an executive leader, no one is born out of the womb becoming and naturally being an executive leader. No one's born knowing exactly what to do, working within the corporate structures. So a lot of what we do actually will feel foreign and perhaps inauthentic. So as an executive leader, you've got to learn to be very discerning. You got to be discerning between what is newness, what is maybe discomfort that you're experiencing because you're doing something for the first time or leading at a level you've never led before, and the difference between that and quote unquote inauthenticity. Is that a word? Being inauthentic. And you got to make sure you discern between those two and make sure that you're not hiding behind this thought of, well, it's inauthentic. So here's some of the statements that I hear some senior executives get wrong. Saying things like, well, when faced with doing something new within their leadership style for the first time, well, this is just not my style, or this is just who I am. This is my style, and I'm going to stay with this. And I hear this sometimes where people say, I don't want to change who I am, or that's just not me. I don't public speak, or I don't do that. Right. And so these definitive statements that leaders make when they have bigger goals, those two things are misaligned. So here's my coaching philosophy. I believe that when you're becoming an executive leader and you're growing and you're expanding your range, you're not actually abandoning who you are. You're becoming more of who you want to be in your future self, but you're not abandoning your core. You're expanding your range. Okay. And so I want to tell you a little bit of a story about a client that will help give this example. Once I had an introverted executive leader that believed executive presence meant becoming louder and more aggressive. And that felt really inauthentic. And so what we coached through instead is that we built a leadership style that was super intentional around who this person was and how they could lead in a way that wasn't contradictory to themselves and their core. And so things that we did, and some examples were to be able to speak first, and it didn't have to be often and throughout the entire meeting, but definitely led the way. They would lead and give clarity to the meeting by setting the agenda, letting them know who would be speaking and when to include themselves. They would give clarity to everyone in the group. They would land their point and then stop speaking. And they would use their silence very strategically, but they still led in a way that their voice was heard. And the result was this leader now, I see them very successfully show up very regularly regularly, speaking very confidently in a way that works for this leader. And instead of abandoning their authenticity, it actually gave this person better and greater authority. It also didn't drain his energy to do the things that we're talking about. And it gave him more credibility in the room that wasn't in contradictory to his own beliefs and who he wanted to be. And so that, my friends, can be available to you too. And again, this is just one small example in the many of ways that you can show up in a way that's still aligned with your goals without abandoning your authenticity. Okay. So let me give you a quick framework. Like I said, I want to give you something tactical to take away and to use. So part 4 about this is all about giving you this tool. Alignment is a strategic choice. It's who you want to be and then aligning it with how you want to show up. So I'm going to give you a very simple alignment framework that can be memorable and used. So 3 steps, super tactical, and you can walk away with. Number 1, you can ask yourself the question, what level am I actually playing at? And again, this one is a little bit self-reflective. It helps you give yourself role clarity and be honest with yourself. And this may change depending on the situation, depending on the event that you're in. But what level am I actually playing at? That just gives yourself the clarity to say, where am I starting from? Where is my starting point here in terms of my alignment? The next step that you want to take is to give yourself some what I call signal awareness. What am I signaling through my words, through my energy? Energy is so important, and my boundaries. So, what am I signaling? This third step then is to make some intentional adjustments. Ask yourself the question, what needs to shift now to support where I'm going and where I'm headed? So these 3 steps can be super helpful: role clarity, signal awareness, intentional adjustment. And I want you to tap into your own wisdom here. You know, if you can give yourself time to sit and think about this, tap into your own wisdom, and or you can also use others' objectivity, people that you trust, people you admire. Get some feedback here from multiple opinions, not just one. But really, the goal here is, if you say you want enterprise influence and you are headed towards some of these big goals that I know you're setting for this year, but you're still running around and you're trying to outperform everyone and you're trying to solve everybody else's problems and you're hiding behind some of these, again, these altruistic sounding statements, and you're not getting to where you want to be, you're not hitting the goals that you want to hit, then that is a sign that you're misaligned. And so that's what I have for you today, friends. In closing, I just want to say executive presence is not about you yourself being an individual contributor and being impressive. It's about being super intentional. And your executive presence and how you carry yourself is now layering on top of the performance that you've brought as a younger leader and carrying yourself into the next stratosphere of leadership. All right, friends, that's what I have for you this week. I want you to get this offer from me. Reflect on one misalignment that you might be having this week. And if you are ready to explore one-on-one coaching, if you're ready to recalibrate how you are showing up, please do not hesitate. Reach out to me. You can go to my website. You can go to schedule a consult call with me. We can talk through all of the things in a low pressure, no pressure environment and just see if it would be the right fit to talk through how to get to the next level, how to build your executive presence, and how to, again, achieve these goals that you are after in 2026 and beyond. My website is Alicia Cowan Coaching, ELISAKEOWN coaching.com. It is always in the show notes. You can totally find me there, and I would be so happy to help you. And as always, I appreciate you listening. Have a fantastic week, and we'll talk to you next time. Thanks, friends.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Executive Coaching Podcast with Alicia Cowan. If you're ready to have an executive coach who's ready to help you lead your team to success, then book an introductory call at aliciacowancoaching.com/call.